The idea that for thousands of years, humanity was essentially trapped in a collective delusion. We had pharaohs, Caesars, shahs, and kings, all convinced they were divinely appointed to rule, while everyone else was just fodder, expendable. Then suddenly, the illusion breaks. But it didn't break because of a philosophical debate or a sudden enlightenment. It broke because we almost wiped ourselves off the face of the map.
It is a grim realization, but necessary. We tend to romanticize the past, the grandeur of Rome, the mysteries of Egypt, the might of the Persian Empire. But if you strip away the marble statues and the poetry, what you're left with is a system of governance based entirely on predation. The text we are analyzing today, an essay by Mustafa Sajjad Haider, written just recently in January 2026, posits exactly this. It argues that history wasn't a progression of valid governing styles, but a catalog of barbarism that only stopped or paused because the industrial slaughter of the 20th century frightened us into submission.
And that's the core tension we need to unpack today. The essay outlines a specific trajectory from the jungle life of ancient empires to the unlearning process we began after 1945. Haider makes a provocative claim right at the start. He lists them all: Hammurabi, Cyrus the Great, Alexander, Genghis Khan, the British Empire, and asks, which system was best? His answer is none of them. They were all fundamentally flawed because they were built on the premise that the ruler is distinct from the ruled, often dangerously so.
Precisely. The argument is that these leaders were trapped in a feedback loop of narcissism and paranoia. Whether it was Nebuchadnezzar or the British Raj, the operating software was the same. My group is chosen noble and clean. Your group is wretched, impure, or demonic. Haider uses very strong language here, describing how rulers viewed others as worthy of beheading or pollution. This isn't just historical hyperbole. Psychological historians often refer to this as pseudo-speciation, the tendency to classify an enemy as a different, inferior species, to make killing them easier. Haider argues this was the default human setting until the bomb dropped.
Let's dwell on that turning point. The essay suggests that the First and Second World Wars weren't just conflicts. They were the moment the jungle became too dangerous to inhabit. He paints a very graphic picture of the social collapse during those wars. He talks about bodies lying unburied, the total breakdown of sexual morality and dignity, purely for survival, women selling themselves for bread. It's a stripping away of civilization's veneer.
It is the moment the predator became afraid of its own teeth. Before 1914, and certainly before 1939, there was a belief that war could be glorious, or at least controlled. The aristocracy believed they could send the peasantry to die while they moved pieces on a map. Haider points out that the introduction of aerial bombardment and nuclear weaponry erased the safety of the ruling class. When the rich could be vaporized just as easily as the poor, the calculus changed. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in his view, weren't just tragedies, they were the ultimate wake-up call that no God is coming to save us.
That's the cynical but compelling take on the birth of the United Nations. We didn't invent human rights because we suddenly became moral. We invented them because we were terrified of extinction. It was a survival mechanism. But the essay does offer a few historical exceptions, doesn't it? It's not entirely bleak.
He makes two specific exceptions, which is historically astute. He mentions Cyrus the Great and the Magna Carta. Cyrus, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire in the 6th century BCE, is famous for the Cyrus Cylinder, which many scholars consider the first declaration of human rights, allowing repatriations and religious freedom. And then the Magna Carta in 1215, where British barons forced the king to admit he wasn't above the law. But Haider dismisses these as drops in the ocean compared to the overwhelming tide of tyranny. They were anomalies, not the norm.
So, fast forward to the post-1945 world, we have the UN, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The essay argues this was the beginning of us unlearning our animal instincts. He frames it almost as a rehabilitation program for a savage species. But he notes that the process is stalling. He explicitly mentions Kashmir and Palestine as open wounds where that old jungle logic still applies.
He identifies those as flashpoints where the post-WW2 consensus has failed. He also critiques African leadership where tribalism, again, that us versus them mentality, has prevented the modernization of the state. The argument here is that while the West and parts of the East have successfully suppressed the predator instinct through commerce and democracy, the underlying nature of humanity hasn't changed. We are still part of nature, and nature dictates that the strong eat the weak. The unlearning process requires constant vigilance.
This brings us to the most prescriptive part of the text. Haider doesn't just complain, he offers 9 specific proposals to keep this unlearning on track. Some of these are quite radical, particularly for the context of South Asia or the developing world. Let's walk through the most significant ones. The first is education, but not just literacy. He wants children to be taught human evolution.
This is a direct attack on the myth-making that fuels conflict. By teaching evolution and the biological reality of human origins, you strip away the divine narratives that justify superiority. If you teach a child that they share a common ancestor with the child across the border, rather than teaching them that they were created by a specific god to rule over the other, you undermine the psychological root of war. It's an attempt to replace theological tribalism with biological universalism.
Which segues into his second and third points, the secularization of public life. He suggests discouraging religious displays in mixed societies. And this is interesting, asking charities to drop their religious branding. It feels like he's arguing that religion, while perhaps personally comforting, operates as a brand in the public sphere that automatically creates an in-group and an out-group.
It is the Red Cross versus Red Crescent dilemma. Even in benevolence, we mark our territory. Haider is suggesting that true humanism requires anonymity in doing good. If you feed the hungry only under the banner of your specific faith, you are still engaging in a form of soft conquest. He wants the state, the democratic, secular state, to take over the role of the primary caregiver. Point 4 calls for humanity welfare centers run by elected representatives, not clergy. He wants the bond of gratitude to be between the citizen and the state, not the citizen and the sect.
That state-centric approach culminates in his most explosive proposal. Point number 5. This is specific to Pakistan, but the principle could apply elsewhere. He calls for all religious seminaries, madrasas, to be declared state orphanages. He wants to remove the clergy's control entirely and hand over administration to civil servants, specifically mentioning CSS officers, Central Superior Services. That is a massive centralization of power.
It is revolutionary, and historically it echoes the kind of reforms we saw in Turkey and Ataturk or during the Meiji Restoration in Japan. He argues that as long as the education and welfare of the poorest children are left to unregulated religious militias, you will produce a jihadist culture. He connects this directly to the legacy of the Afghan War. By converting them into state-run orphanages managed by bureaucrats who are accountable, auditable, and secular, he believes you can sever the pipeline of radicalization. He is essentially saying the state cannot outsource the raising of its most vulnerable children to ideologues.
It's a logistical nightmare, though, isn't it? Managing thousands of institutions. But I see the logic. If the state is absent, non-state actors fill the void. He's arguing the state must reclaim that space to ensure survival. Moving on, he touches on women's rights and economic independence. This feels like a standard progressive talking point, but in the context of unlearning the jungle, it carries more weight.
It is crucial because the subjugation of women is the primary characteristic of the jungle societies he describes. In the pre-1945 world and in current conflict zones, women are resources or currency. By mandating economic independence and representation, you are physically altering the power structure. You are doubling the intellectual and economic capacity of the nation. He specifically notes that while this is settled in the developed world, it is the primary battleground for the third world.
His final points cover minority rights and, surprisingly, leisure. He wants governments to build cinemas, theaters, parks, and stadiums. He links mental health to the presence of art and entertainment. It reminds me of the phrase bread and circuses, but he seems to mean it in a more therapeutic way.
It is therapeutic. Bread and Circuses was about distraction. Haider is talking about civilization. Art, cinema, and sports are exercises in empathy and regulated competition. A society that congregates to watch a film or play cricket is practicing peaceful coexistence. If you remove culture, if you remove the cinema and the park, the only gathering place left is the parade ground or the radical sermon. He views these recreational spaces as the gymnasiums where we train ourselves to be civilized humans rather than territorial animals.
So, looking at this blueprint, education, secular welfare, state control of seminaries, gender equality, and cultural infrastructure, it's essentially a manual for rapid modernization, but he frames it with this looming threat. If we don't do this, the tsunami of our nature will come back. He mentions that human nature is a product of nature, and in nature, only the strong survive. He seems terrified that the peace of the last 80 years is a fluke.
I wouldn't say he views it as a fluke, but rather as a fragile construct that requires constant energy to maintain. Think of it like entropy. The natural state of humanity, according to Haider, is the war of all against all. The UN, democracy, human rights, these are high-energy states. If you stop pumping energy into them through education, vigilance, and reform, the system collapses back into the lower energy state of tyranny. We are seeing cracks in that system right now. The global rise of authoritarianism, the weakening of international law, these are signs that the unlearning is wearing off.
There's also a deep skepticism of the great man theory of history here. He starts by listing these legendary figures, Suleiman, Cyrus, Caesar, and basically calls them successful warlords. We often look for a savior, a strong leader to fix things. Haider's proposals are all systemic. He doesn't say, find a better prime minister. He says, change the school curriculum, audit the orphanages, build a theater. It's a rejection of the hero narrative.
That is the most modern aspect of his thinking. The hero narrative is dangerous because it invites the very dictatorship he fears. If you wait for a Saladin or a Cyrus, you might get a Genghis Khan or a Hitler. By relying on institutions, the UN, the parliament, the civil service, you distribute the risk. It's boring compared to the epics of the past. Building a sewage system or a girls' school isn't as cinematic as conquering Babylon. But Haider's point is that the cinematic version of history is actually a horror movie for the average person.
And it's interesting he dated this piece from London. It adds a layer of perspective, looking at the chaos of the developing world from the vantage point of a society that has at least partially implemented these safety valves. But he warns that even the civilized world isn't immune. He mentions that even the powerful won't be saved by their weaponry in the next war.
That is the nuclear paradox. The weapon that ended the era of total war is also the weapon that guarantees our total destruction if we slip up. He mentions that no mother-son has the courage to ignore Hiroshima. That fear is the glue holding us together. But fear fades. New generations didn't see the bodies in 1945. They didn't smell the trenches. That's why his proposal for education is so vital. We have to artificially implant that memory, or at least the lesson of it, into every new generation. Otherwise, they might think the jungle looks like a playground.
One nuance I want to push back on, or at least explore, is his view of the United Nations. He admits it has failures, but calls it largely positive. In an era where everyone loves to bash the UN as useless, he defends it as the primary mechanism for this unlearning.
He defends it because he compares it to the alternative. The alternative to the UN isn't a better UN, it's the League of Nations, or worse, the Congress of Vienna. Systems of alliances that inevitably led to war. The UN, for all its bureaucratic bloat and veto power paralysis, provides a forum where nations shout at each other instead of shooting at each other. Haider recognizes that this shouting is a form of civilized conflict resolution. It slows down the slide into barbarism. He sees the trade links and the subsidiary organizations, WHO, UNICEF, as the ligaments binding these disparate tribes together.
So, the takeaway from Mustafa Sajjad Haider's essay is essentially a warning, labeled as a roadmap. We are biological creatures with a history of extreme violence, currently living in a temporary bubble of peace created by the shock of the 20th century. To keep the bubble from bursting, we need to actively dismantle the structures of tribalism, religious, national, and gender-based, and replace them with the standardized humanist infrastructure.
Correct. And we must do it with urgency. He uses the metaphor of a tsunami. The instinct to dominate is always there, waiting for a crack in the seawall. His 9 points are the reinforcement bars for that wall. It is a call to abandon the romance of the past, with all its kings and conquests, and embrace the mundane, difficult work of building a society where a human being is just a human being, regardless of where they pray or what they own.
It's a sobering thought to end on. We are not as far removed from the jungle as we like to think. Our suits and smartphones are just thin layers over the same biology that drove the Assyrians and the Mongols. The only thing stopping the fire is our collective decision to keep learning how not to burn. If this discussion sparks some thoughts about where we're heading as a civilization, share this episode with someone you think needs to hear it.